We are ready to begin the class on Kabbalah of Purim. The Kabbalah of Purim. Okay. How many of you have studied the story of the Megillah? Megillah Esther, story of Esther. Some of you, a little bit? A little bit, okay. So briefly, the story of Esther is that there was a king named Achashverosh. This took place roughly about 70 years after the destruction of the first temple. There's a king named Achashverosh. He was not of royal descent. Interesting story of how he got to the throne. But he was at the time the most powerful man in the world. He reigned over 127 provinces. He was extremely powerful. And he made a big party to celebrate his reign and his rule. He invited everyone, including the Jewish people at that time. Many of the Jewish people went. Some of the people did not go. Mordechai, who was the Jewish leader at the time, he said not to go, but there were many who went. And this is going to be significant later for our discussion. Regardless what happened by that party, there was a big discussion that erupted about who's the most beautiful woman. And he said, my queen Vashti is the most beautiful. And they said, well, bring down Queen Vashti to the party. King Vashti refused to go. She came down. The king said, what should I do with this woman that she doesn't want to come to the party? And what did the advisor, whose name was Haman, what did he say? You have to put her to death because it will be a bad example for all the other women, how they disavow their husband. All right. After that, the king now needs a new queen and searches for the most beautiful, most lovely woman in the entire province, the entire kingdom, and he finally comes up with who? With Esther. Esther was a Jewish girl. She grew up in the home of Mordechai, who was her uncle, who also happened to be the leader of the Jewish people. And of all the women that the king could have chosen, he chose Esther. Meanwhile, Haman comes along and says, I don't like the Jewish people. He wants to kill the Jewish people. And he throws a lottery when he wants to destroy the Jewish people. And it falls out on the 13th day of the month of Adar. Okay, he goes to the king. He says, there's this nation. We want to get rid of this nation. And the king says, no problem. He gives an signet ring. He says, go out and destroy. Go do whatever you want to these people. Jewish people are now in mourning. Here he is. He wants to wipe out all the Jewish people in one day, on the 13th day of Adar. Jewish people pray and fast. And then Mordechai goes to Esther and says, you are the queen. You're the only one that can do something. Esther comes to the king, says, let's have a party. Me, you, and Haman. And they get together. Following that, the king cannot sleep. The king is not able to sleep. And that night, they open up the book, and he says, why can I not sleep? Because there's a man who needs to get honored that I have not honored. Who was that man? Mordechai. What had happened? A little while before that, there were two ministers who were plotting to kill the king. And Mordechai went and told the king and saved the king's life. He said, I never did anything for this Mordechai. So he went to his advisor Haman. He says, what can we do to someone that I want to honor? Haman thought it was about him. So he said, go take your best horse and your best advisors and your best men and have them run before the horse in front of the street while it's carrying this man, all thinking it's going to be him. And then he says, go do it to Mordechai. And this is already the beginning of his downfall. Meanwhile, Haman had already gone home and built a gallows 50 cubits high in order to hang Mordechai And then suddenly now he is going and leading, and then the king says the best of all his ministers need to lead him, and he is going and leading Mordechai throughout the street. So Haman, who was now plotting to kill Mordechai, now is leading him in a parade throughout the streets. That night he comes for the second meeting with Esther. Esther said it's going to have a second meeting, and that meeting, Esther, who had not yet revealed to the king that she is Jewish at all, in that meeting she tells the king, there is an individual who wants to destroy my people. King said, who is this man? Haman, this is the man. He wants to destroy me and all the people. Okay, king gets furious, takes out Haman. Now he says, but I can't do anything about it. Why? Because it was already sealed with the king's ring. Something that's sealed with the king's ring you cannot go back on. So he said, however, I can make a new decree. What's the new decree? That Jewish people have the right to fight back. Jewish people fought back on the 13th day of Adar, and then they rested from this fight on the 14th day of Adar, which the 14th day of Adar we now celebrate as the holiday of Purim to commemorate this story. Esther asked, can I have one more day for the people living in Shushan, which was the capital then, of where the king lived, that they could go and finish off the other 10 sons of Haman and some other things that she wanted to do in the city of Shushan. The king says yes. She gave him one more day, and then so that they had their fight on the 14th day, and then they rested on the 15th day, and that's what we know as Shushan Purim. Shushan Purim is the day after Purim, which is celebrated in any walled cities from that time, which includes the city of Jerusalem and some other cities throughout Israel that had walled cities that they actually celebrate on the 15th of Adar, not on the 14th of Adar. After that, the Megillah goes on and says, because of this, you're going to have an annual celebration, an annual party, and we're going to call it Purim. And the Megillah says that you should send gifts to each other, which is one of the mitzvahs of Purim, to send 2 gifts to friends, Mishloach Manot, to give gifts to the poor, Matanot Levyonim, to read the story of the Megillah, and to have a feast on that day. And to have a feast and literally to really celebrate, and that the Talmud even says to get drunk so much that you don't know the difference between blessed Mordechai and cursed Haman. That's in short the story of Purim. Of course, there's much more. It's one of the most fascinating stories in our Jewish history. It's not officially one of the biblical holidays. This is what's called a rabbinic holiday because it was added later, although the story of Purim is actually part of the 24 books of what's called the Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Prophets, Ksuvim, and Writings. The Tanakh, that's what the word comes from. And so it's officially part of the Torah, unlike Hanukkah, which the story of Hanukkah is not actually placed in any part of the Torah, but the story of Purim was. Okay? We're all good now. Yeah? All right. Now we're going to talk about the actual holiday of Purim. So let's take a look at text number 1. This is a text from the Megillah itself. It says, for Haman, the son of Hamdata the Agagite, so he also came from Agag, who was a descendant of Amalek, nation of Amalek. That's why also next Shabbos, which is the Shabbos before Purim, we read the story of Amalek because Haman was a descendant of Amalek. So what happens? So what does it read? The enemy of all Jews had schemed against the Jews to destroy them and had cast a pur, that is the lot, to consume them and to destroy them. Number 2, for this they did call these days Purim, after the poor. Now that sounds very strange. So of all things that happened in this story, this is about a great woman, Esther, about a great man, Mordechai, about the Jewish people, about the great things that happened then. Of all things, we decide that what are we going to call this holiday? Purim? For what?
The lot.
For the lot, which seems to be first of all, it's an insignificant part of the story, seemingly insignificant part of the story. that it just means he made a lot of which day to pick for his scheme. And all good? And aside for that, it's a scheme that Haman, the hater of the Jews, came and picked for his day of how he's going to destroy them. And so what do we decide? What are we going to call Purim? The holiday Purim, the lots. You couldn't find anything better to name the holiday? Call it the Esther holiday. Call it the Hamantash. We have those. We eat Hamantash too. Not only that, but Purim is actually not even a Hebrew word. Purim is a Persian word. In Hebrew, the word for a lottery is gorel. A gorel is a lottery. Or, well, if you go to Israel, they call a lottery lotto, if you want to buy the lotto. But
it's like Yom Kippur.
Wait, we're getting there. So Purim is a Persian word, and that's what we call the holiday. It's also interesting to note that God's name is not mentioned in the Megillah at all. We don't find God's name at all mentioned in the Megillah. And it says why? Esther's name.
That was a Persian name. Esther.
That wasn't actually her name, right? Esther means to hide. The Talmud asks, how do I know? Is there any reference to the story of Purim in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses? And the Talmud says, it says in the Torah, "V'anochi haster aster panai bayom hahu." God says, I'm going to hide my face on that day. God's hidden face is represented in Esther, because Esther was her hidden name. That wasn't her real name. Her real name was Hadassah. But she didn't want the king to know she's Jewish, so she made a name called Esther, which became a Jewish name, of course. So essentially, the name Purim is not for the actual, the name Purim is for the lottery, which seems to be an insignificant and unimportant part of the entire story. Now, let's read text number 3, a little bit more detail. This is when the lottery actually took place. The first text was what the Talmud tells us about the lottery. The other text is just a refresher of where it took place. In the Talmud, the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year, King Ahasuerus reigned, a Pur, which is a lot, was cast before Haman for every day and every month, and it fell on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. So it's always going to be the 12th month, or sometimes the 13th month, you have the lottery, Purim, right? Now, when he cast this lot, the Talmud tells us something very interesting. Let's read text number 4. The Talmud tells us, when the Gorel lot landed on the month of Adar, Haman was pleased, because this month was not favorable for the Jewish people, since Moshe passed away on the 7th of Adar. However, he was not aware that Moshe was born on that same day. So what does that mean? Does it mean that he was smart enough to know that Moses passed away on that day, but he wasn't smart enough to know that he was born on that day? So what was he so excited about? What was it exactly that he was trying to express through the idea of the Pur, through the idea of the lottery? So with that being said, we want to take a look at another holiday, which is also connected to a Pur, also connected to a lottery. And it may see a very strange connection between two holidays. Which holiday is that? The holiday of Yom Kippur. Those who were here for the Kabbalah of Yom Kippur, we talked about the lottery and what it represents. Yom Kippur is actually in the Torah referred to as Yom Kippurim. If you were to break up that word, it would be Yom Kippurim. It would actually be translated as the day like Purim. Kippurim means a day like Purim. So there's an intrinsic connection between Yom Kippur and Purim. Now, of course, they're celebrated very differently. Yom Kippur, we sit in synagogue, we fast, we don't eat. It's a much more serious holiday. Purim seems like a polar opposite of Yom Kippur. We celebrate, we feast, we get dressed up, which is also connected to what we mentioned about God hiding his face on that day. It's also the reason that we get dressed up on Purim. It seems like the polar opposite of Yom Kippur. How can you put the two together? So what essentially is actually the connection between those days? Purim being the most physical day of the year, day of feasting, a day of drinking, a day of celebration. Yom Kippur being the most spiritual day of the year, a day of observance, of fasting, and so on. So the answer is the connection is with this word Purim. Purim meaning a lot. Because there's actually a lottery that was cast on Yom Kippur as well. What was that lottery? Verse number 6. At the beginning of the parsha, the service of the Kohen Gadol, high priest, on Yom Kippur is described. He would draw lots over 2 goats to decide which one would be for God. That is, brought as a sacrifice in the holy temple, in which one would be sent to Azazel, the name of the steep cliff to which the goat would be thrown, both thus atoning for the sins of the nation of Israel. So, what was the idea of the lot on Yom Kippur? You had these 2 goats, and each one, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, would make these lots. One was for God, for a sacrifice to atone for the Jewish people's sins, and that was brought as an offering to God, and the other one was sent to Azazel. Also, both the idea of atoning, but you had this concept of a lottery. There was a lottery that was made between 2 goats that were the same. They would both be on the side of the high priest on Yom Kippur. He would put down the lottery. One said for God, one said to Azazel. Each one was sent to a different place, and each one was there to atone for the Jewish people through this lottery. So what is the idea of the lottery? What is it so significant that we see that on Yom Kippur, the entire holiday is based on this lottery? And Purim, we take the lottery and say, this is the most significant part of the entire holiday. The Purim, that is what the holiday is all about. Now, this is a question that on surface is difficult to answer, but when you take a little bit of a deeper look from a Kabbalistic level, you actually find a very deep, important, intrinsic connection here that can give us a very important view of what the holiday of Purim is all about and why it's such a significant holiday that even Yom Kippur could only be called a holiday like Purim, which means that which is greater? Purim. If Yom Kippur is a holiday like Purim, so then it means that which is the greater holiday? Purim is a greater holiday. Because Yom Kippurim is only the holiday like Purim. In other words, it's looking up to Purim, wants to be like Purim.
Were they trying to, those were the Persians, were they trying to sacrifice the Jews as like a sacrifice?
No.
For them? Through paganism? No?
No. Well, that's a good point, because if the Jewish people were to change their way, then the outcome may have been different. But we're going to get to that in a moment.
Okay.
So in order to understand this, let's first understand what's the idea of a lot. What's the idea of casting a lot? When you're casting a lottery, I have a friend. He passed away, Dr. Flegel, of blessed memory. His name is up there on the board. He's a great man, a doctor in this community. And he used to come to me every year Purim. He used to buy a lottery ticket every single year Purim. And he told me sometimes he won the lottery that he would buy on Purim. He said Purim is a time of a lottery. He bought a lottery ticket every year on Purim. And he won sometimes. Don't buy it. I want to buy it this year. What is the idea of a lottery? A lottery ticket. Whoops, drop that. Yeah, it's okay. Just leave it. It's not important. It's not important. It's not important. When you're casting a lottery, you're saying that I am taking something and I'm leaving it out of my choice, out of my decision. I am putting my choice now in the lot. So the lottery is basically saying that what I am now putting myself in a state beyond any reason, beyond any understanding of why I am choosing something. I am putting myself in a state where what is going to happen is going to be completely incomprehensible. Because if I was truly able to explain why I'm choosing something, I wouldn't need a lottery. If you go to a car store, to a car dealer, and they tell you, here you have two cars. They're exactly the same cars, except one has a DVD player inside, one has a navigation system inside, one has a leather seat inside, the other one don't. They look like the same car, but they're not the same car. That's not a lottery of a choice. You're deciding what you want to choose. A true lottery means I have two of the exact same things on the table. Here's two exact same papers. I have no reason that I would want to choose one over the other, and yet I'm choosing one. That's a lottery. So when we talk about Haman's wanting to make a lottery, what was the idea that he wanted to cast this lottery? Haman said, I want to exploit the supra-rationality of the divine to the opposite end. Meaning he said like this. He said, if God is choosing the Jewish people, God's not just going to want to destroy his people. Why in the world would God want to do that? Now, as we do mention, there was a sin. You see in the Talmud, the students of text number 7, the students of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai asked him, Master, what was it that brought about the terrible decree against the Jews of Shushan? What was their crime? What do you think the reason was? Rabbi Shimon rejoined, they enjoyed from the meal that wicked man Achashverosh, the disciples responded. To make it clear, they ate kosher there. At least they were offered kosher. They ate kosher wine. It wasn't necessarily that they sinned, but that they enjoyed the meal of that wicked man, Achashverosh. Haman said, look, for my scheme to come about, I can't bring it about in a natural way. Because there will always be opposition. Why should God want to agree with me to destroy his people? He said, look, I have to reach a place where the notions of virtue and deservedness, or the virtues of evil and good, over there are not relevant. When I am able to tap into a place where choice is not made by virtue, but literally made by decision, so maybe at that point I can throw in a little sin there and say, now God, you'll be on my side, now you'll understand. And what happened? It worked.
Can you say that again so I can get it sorted out in my
You're
brain?
not following.
Yeah, I
Okay.
have to sort it out in my brain.
When you're making a lottery, what are you saying? You're saying that I am going to make a decision based on something that is not rationally explained. Right? Something that is beyond. It is a super-rational explanation of what's going to be done. Now, within God, there's different spiritual levels as well. There's the way God operates within his physical realm, within the physical world. And then there's the way God operates beyond the physical realm. For those who came last time to the Kabbalah class, we talked about the level of Mamali Kalalman, God's connecting to each individual according to their needs, and Soviv Kalalman, the way God is above and beyond the needs of every single individual. When you talk about the level of godliness connecting to each and every individual, then that is a level of virtue. The way you act is the way you're treated. There's good, there's evil. There's right, there's wrong. Then if you're able to tap into a higher place, to a higher spiritual realm, you're coming to a place that says that good and evil are not going to make my choice here. What does make my choice? The simple choosing of something beyond anything specific. Like choosing between two papers that one may not be better than the other. And Haman said, if I'm going to talk on virtue on a basic level, on a simple level, if I'm going to say, look, I want to destroy the Jewish people, God's not going to agree with me on that. God says, look, the Jewish people have not done anything bad enough that they're worthy of destruction. So why should you destroy them? Remember, Haman epitomizes the ultimate enemy of the Jews. The ultimate enemy of the Jews, meaning that level that comes out against them in higher spiritual realms, coming and saying, the Jews are deserving of destruction. Why? Why are they deserving of destruction? So if you say because they enjoyed a meal, is that deserving of destruction? So Haman said, I need to go to a level that is beyond the simple rational level where I can say, you don't really have any reason to choose these people. It's beyond any reason. You can't really explain why you should want them over us. Why should you want these people over us? Why are they any better? Haman came along and said to Achashverosh, Yeshna Amacha, there's a nation who are different than us. They have different religion, they have a different culture, they have different laws. Haman said, why should these people be deserving of anything better than we are? And Haman said, the only way that I could connect to that point is if I'm going to connect to a spiritual realm that says that there is no choice in good or bad, but it's beyond my choice. It's going to be a lot. It's going to be a lottery. A lottery says it's super rational. There's not any real specific reason for this choice. It's beyond any rational explanation. It's a lottery. I'm casting it. Whatever comes out happens. So his only chance to, so to speak, convince God, so to speak, of his scheme would be through a lottery. To say, God, look, I'm going to cast this and put it on you. And you're going to tell me what's that right time for that. I'm not going to decide. You're going to tell me. And which month did it come out on? Came out on the month of Adar. And he said to himself, hey, that's the day that Moses is passing. He said, look, Moses may have been the one that gave the Jewish people the Torah, but this month proves that even that has a expiration date. Day of Moses passing. Even that has a time that ends. So yes, the Jewish people may have been God's people at some point, but that ends at some point. It's over now. Remember, this was 70 years after the destruction of the Holy Temple. And so he said, look, this lot proves the mortality of the Jewish people, that there really is no reason for their choice. Just like Moses, mortal being, has an expiration date. Time is up. This is the proof that this is the best time. Following me still? Or am I too confusing?
Then he went to Ahasuerus.
Then he went to Achashverosh. So, any questions so far?
Well,
Do you understand?
Did Haman really know Moses died on that day or born on that day?
Why not?
To make that decision, to make that lot?
You should know that historically, a lot of our enemies were very, very knowledgeable in our writings.
Yeah.
Throughout history, I mean, you know, the debates that the Christians forced on the Jewish people in the medieval centuries, they knew the Talmud inside out. They would go and say, you know, it says this in your Talmud, it says that in your Talmud. Not only the Torah, not only the Bible itself, the Talmud, they knew it inside out. They even censored some things because they claimed that it was blasphemous according to their beliefs. So our enemies are not like they are today. Today, most of them are not that knowledgeable in what we believe.
It's just like the Nazis, when they had the court and they convicted the 9, and they said, remember Haman, because they hanged 9 sons of Haman.
Right, and that actually happened on Purim.
Yeah.
No, that happened on Purim. The last one, I think they said,
Was
He
it,
hanged himself.
he called out Purim
it
Fest.
was 10 sons,
He
wasn't there?
killed himself,
The-
so
the-
it wouldn't be 9.
Right. Yeah, it happened on Purim. Very, very interesting. Anyway, so what Haman failed to realize, however, that it was also the day of Moses' birth. That as much as he was analyzing this, God was saying at the same time that there is also an element of birth there. An element of birth is when someone comes into the world and maybe new, and maybe something that is a new relationship in this world, but it's also something of a soul that always was existence. When Haman came along and cast his lot, so the decree actually fell on the Jewish people. But there's one point in the Megillah, in the story, that the Talmud says that it's from this story, this part of the story, that the miracle actually began. What was the part of that story? The part of that story was when it says, on that night, Balaylahu, on that night, Nadida Shnas HaMelech, the king could no longer sleep. He wasn't able to sleep that night. What happened that night after he couldn't sleep? So as I said before, then he realized that there was a person that didn't pay back, and that was Mordechai, and Haman happened to be coming in then, and he said, what can you do, and what should I do to a person that I want to honor, and so on. That all happened on that night, which was the night after the first party with Esther. So the Talmud says that at that point you should raise your voice a little bit to say that this is where the real miracle begins. The fact that Haman didn't want to sleep. Achashverosh was not able to sleep. What is the significance of the idea that he wasn't able to sleep? We're told that God's name is not found throughout the entire Megillah. However, whenever it says the word Hamelech, the king, it references God. That's a reference to God as well. Even though it's not clearly talking about God, it's talking about Achashverosh, but in a higher, deeper way, it's referencing God as well. So God's name is hidden in the Megillah. When it says the king couldn't sleep, that's referring to God, saying that God is not the Yanav Laisha and Shomi Yisrael. The protector of the Jewish people is not able to sleep. What essentially was happening on that night? What was happening that night was God said, I can't sleep. I cannot allow for this godly level, which was being asleep at that time, I cannot allow for that to be effective. Meaning that God was reawakened to say that even though Haman came along and said, God, look, I'm going to throw a cast, I'm going to cast a lottery. And this lottery is going to say there is no difference between me and them, between us and them. There's no reason that you really have to pick the Jewish people. On that night, God couldn't sleep. And God said that regardless, I'm going to pick the Jewish people as well. Hence the story of choosing Mordechai over Achashverosh began that night. Why? Because even in a moment when the Jewish people did have a sin, and even in a moment when there was reason that Haman was able to come along and say, look, I cast these lotteries, and it shows that the Jewish people are deserving of destruction because I came to a point where there is no reason to say that the Jewish people are any greater than they are. Nevertheless, God wasn't able to sleep that night. And the reason for that is because the Jewish people went through an entire year of prayer and of study and of so many different things that they could have come along, and all they had to do was say, I'm disavowing my religion. I'm not going to prove my Jewish faith anymore. But yet, an entire year, not a single Jew came along and did that, even though there may have been reason to do so. And this essence of the Jew that says that no matter what I do, even if I'm a person that's sinning, and even if I'm a person that has done many things that are not good, but regardless, every Jew at some point is a Jew that's always filled with mitzvahs. At some point, a Jew is never going to give up the spirit of who he really is. When faced with this challenge, when Haman comes along and says, are you ready to give up being a Jew, or are you ready to give up your life? And they went for an entire year, not a single Jew came forth and said, all right, I'm going to give up being a Jew. That reached a place where God says, you know what? Whatever Haman, whatever you're trying to prove here, whatever you're trying to bring out, there's still something deeper. There's still a higher place. That whatever your lottery is reaching, there's still a higher place that your lottery can't reach. Your lottery reached a place to say, God, look, there's no virtue, there's no good, there's no bad. There's no reason that you should pick these people. And after an entire year of that decree, God says, well, now it's been very clear that I should choose these people. Even though there may not be real, substantial proof for it, even though there may not be anything significant that you could say that they're really deserving on a more basic level, but the fact that they were able to reach a place in their soul that was beyond any sin that they may have committed or that they may have done, they are now reaching a place that is much deeper and much higher, a place where their essence of the soul is pure and cannot be affected. And that's a place that they were able to reach during that time on Purim. And therefore God said that as much as you are trying to reach Haman with your lottery, nevertheless they have reached a place that's even higher than what you're trying to reach there. In other words, the lottery says I'm trying to reach a high place beyond any rational explanation, beyond any rational reasoning, something that I'm willing to cast my lots and say that we're all equal. Let's cast our lots, we're all equal. The Jews, Haman, it's all equal, same thing. So God says, after a full year, seeing the Jewish soul come out and not a single one of them were willing to give up on me, not a single Jew is willing to give up on God, God says, that even though you claim they're all equal, they're really not all equal. And there's still reason for me to choose them. Because they are dedicated people, even though they may have sinned, and even though there may have been some evil things that you can prove to me. And even though you may want to come and show, look, they did things that are not along the route that the Torah says they should be doing. Nevertheless, after a full year, I see that the soul coming out in a way that they are so dedicated that they are not going to give up on anything, that they are not going to denounce their Jewish faith no matter what happens. After an entire year, God says, your lots have been overruled by my lots, and I'm going to choose them. Yeah.
I'm a little confused.
Yeah.
Because at first you said deserving of destruction, and now you're saying the Jews are deserving not to be destroyed.
Right. In the beginning they were, because in the beginning,
But how could...
in the beginning Haman said, look, they sinned. So they sinned, so they're not any better than us. So we're equal. Right?
But if they were equal, then why would they be deserving of destruction?
Because they defied God by a sin that they did. Well, that's what Haman tried to claim. That they had sinned, and therefore they're equal. They're Haman said, I may be a bad guy, but they're bad too. So, now we're on an equal playing field. So throw your lots, and the lots will be on whatever comes out. And he said, the lots say that they're deserving of destruction, so they're deserving of destruction. Is that difficult to comprehend?
Not just the deserving of destruction.
Well, I mean, of course, this was Haman's claim.
Yeah.
I'm not saying the actual law. However, we do see that there was an actual decree. It wasn't simply that it's just what he claimed. There was an actual decree that came out of the Jewish people. They had to fast, they had to pray,
Isn't it an unusual term for someone to be deserving of destruction?
Right. I'm only using it in the context that you should understand the idea of the lottery.
Brother,
Yeah.
Haman was implying a moral equivalent.
How did she get
You
out of bed?
understand that? You know what that is? People equate
Okay.
certain things. They say this is the moral equivalent. And that's why he called for the equality. Oh boy, somebody wants daddy. Oh.
She saw daddy.
We have people that do that today. They propose a moral equivalent to make it things the same, even though what they're doing is evil.
That's
You see it every day,
Yeah.
okay?
Right. I'm not saying that that's actually the way it is. I'm saying that was Haman's claim. That's what I'm trying to say.
Well, he's making a moral
He
equivalent.
was making a moral equivalence. That's the idea of a lottery. A lottery is a moral equivalence. That's what we're trying
Exactly.
to explain, the idea of the lottery. So, and that's why Haman chose a lottery, because by a lottery, you're saying that there's an equivalence between the two. And when there's an equivalence between the two, Haman says, I could pull out my plan in this way. In other words, he was saying the only way I could pull out my plan is by making a lottery, because a lottery says that there's no reason that one has to be better than the other. Whatever is chosen is chosen. That's the concept of a lottery. I'm casting a lot, however it falls out, it falls out. And he said, look at the day that it fell out. It fell out on the day, or in the month of Moses passing. Their leader passed on this day. Right? And so the miracle is that regardless of that lottery, still, God says, I'm still going to choose them. And that's why the holiday, if it says, it was called Purim for the poor. Pur is a singular, a lottery. Purim means the lotteries. What were the lotteries? And the answer is there were two lotteries. The first lottery was the lottery of Haman, where he chose a day to destroy the people. And the second lottery was a lottery which came out and said, your lottery is no more valid anymore. Your lottery is not a real lottery.
Actually, it's
Okay.
it's a reverse.
It's God's lottery.
Reverse lottery.
Reverse lottery. I guess you can put it that way. All right. Is it a little more clear now? Okay. So, in the words of the prophet, he says, the prophet Malachi says, is Esav not the brother of Jacob? Aren't they twins? Esav and Jacob are twins. So why, God, why do you choose Jacob? And God says, regardless, even though they're twins, still I choose Jacob. Even though I could have chosen Esav, but still I chose Jacob. And this is essentially what we celebrate on this day. That the Jewish people were able to stand out by living an entire year without changing their belief, without changing their faith. And this awakened God that said God was not able to sleep on that day as well. So why does the miracle begin on the day, on the story, which says, on that night the king could not sleep? Because what does it mean the king could not sleep? It means God was not able to sleep, meaning that he was kept awake, so to speak. Obviously God doesn't sleep, but that God's spirit was kept awake with the fact that the Jewish people's spirit were kept awake as well. The verse in Psalm says, Ani yeshna, ani yeshena v'li bi'er. I am sleeping, but my heart is awake. And the Talmud translated, I am sleeping in exile, but my heart is awake to the Shekhinah, to God's presence. That sometimes the Jewish people may be sort of like they're kind of sleeping. You don't see the Jewish spirit there. And so the Jewish people were sort of a little bit asleep. So that caused that by God is also sort of the idea of sleeping. That's what it means. How can you say God is sleeping? It means that the Jewish people sleeping caused, in a certain sense, this concept of sleep by God, that God wasn't being revealed by them. It was as if being asleep. And when it came through the fact that during this year, that they all stood out with their Jewish faith, and none of them changed that, so that reawakened their connection to God in a way that God, so to speak, was not sleeping either. And that's where the miracle of Purim began. And so now we see a much deeper and better connection with the holiday of Yom Kippur. Because what is the holiday of Yom Kippur? For those of you who are here on our Kabbalah of Yom Kippur, we talked about a very similar concept. The idea of teshuvah, the idea of repentance, where we reach a place beyond sin. That even though a person sins an entire year, but it comes a time of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and a person is able to atone for his sins because we are awakening our deeper sense of our soul, which is not affected by that sin. But nevertheless, Purim is still a greater holiday than Yom Kippur. Why? Because as much as Yom Kippur, we're able to reach beyond our sins through fasting and atoning and through repentance, on Purim it could be done without repentance. On Purim it could be done through celebration, through eating, through drinking, through celebrating. Only on Purim could we reach that time. Why? Because on Purim we reach such a high place that as high as Haman wanted to reach with his lots, on Purim we reach a place which is even beyond that, and the essence of the Jew is chosen. And God says, I want to choose these people even though there may not be any rational explanation for it. Yeah, you have a question?
Well, but there were 3 days of fasting at Purim. 3 days of fasting of Esther.
Right.
Yes.
At that time, yes, but we don't do that. We don't do that today. Well, we do have a commemorative fast, but that's not on Purim. It's before Purim. You're actually not allowed to fast on Purim,
And
as opposed to Yom Kippur, where you fast on the actual holiday of Yom Kippur.
I didn't know that, so I used to do it.
What you used
I
to
used to
do?
fast the 3 days.
You used to fast when?
3 days of Esther.
Oh, you used to fast 3 days for Esther. You know what time of the year that fast actually took place?
Well, I don't know.
It was on the festival of Passover. That was the only time that the Jewish people officially, as a nation, fasted on Passover. There are some people that have a custom. On the second day of Passover, they have a special dish to commemorate that time. So
The other thing I found, someone said that God's name was in the middle of the Megillah. So I counted all the words, I couldn't find it in the middle, but I found it in the middle verse. There were four words. It had Yud, started with Yud, a Hey, and a Vav, and a Hey.
well, there are numerous references to God's name in the Megillah, but it isn't actually named. And so Yom Kippur, and so why is there a difference in the way it plays out in Yom Kippur and Purim? So in Yom Kippur, what we're doing is we're essentially rising above any physical elements that we have in order to bring about the salvation through repentance. On Purim, on the other hand, what we're doing is we're taking such a great lofty place within our soul, and we're saying that we're going to bring that down even to our food and drink, even to our celebration. We're going to take down that lofty place in our soul, and we're going to bring it into everything. That our life shouldn't only be in a way that from time to time it has to be reawakened, our soul, but our soul should be affecting everything that we do. Our eating, our drinking, our celebrating should all come to this place. And that's why there's a mitzvah on Purim that you drink to the point that you don't know the difference between blessed Mordechai and cursed Haman. Why such a seemingly ridiculous custom? But the reason is because, again, it's bringing out the idea that we're reaching a place through our eating and drinking on this holiday that no other holiday can reach. And this holiday we're reaching such an essential place within our souls that even the greatest of holidays that we celebrate, only on Purim does it bring out that even if you want to put an equilibrium between Mordechai and Haman, still that choice is going to be on this holiday of Purim for Mordechai. And so this is what the holiday of Purim is about. And there are 4 mitzvahs, as we mentioned, on Purim. The first mitzvah is to read the story of the Megillah and to go over it. And there's so many fascinating things within the story of the Megillah. Second thing is to give gifts of food to each other, gifts of food to our friends, and to people, at least 2 gifts of food to 2 friends. Or at least to 1 friend, at least 2 gifts of food to a friend, better to 2. To give gifts to the poor, and also to have a festive meal. Festive meal is a mitzvah on the second day, meaning on the daytime of Purim. The mitzvah to read the Megillah is both night and day. The other mitzvahs are more specifically by daytime. And of course, we're going to have a Purim party here as well. I'm going to stop this. We're going